Hello there, my name's Phil Williams and I would like to welcome you to Audio Angling, the podcast site of fishingfilmsandfacts.co.uk. I'm actually recording this particular interview on what is my regular small boat fishing patch, except that today I'm aboard the Fleetwood charter boat Blue Mink, skippered by Andy Bradbury. In some ways, this podcast links to and picks up from an earlier interview with Fleetwood veteran Frank B., who was the man responsible both for developing Fleetwood as a modern-day charter angling port and for opening up Morecambe Bay as a targeted fishery, before turning his back on the skippering side of things around the start of the 1980s by switching his allegiance to small boat fishing along the Fylde coast. Now I know you've made the same journey, only this time in reverse, and in terms of timing, certainly with the small boat fishing, should have had some sort of an overlap with Frank during the famous jumbo cod years. But you'll almost certainly be working from a very different Fleetwood as a charter port and Morecambe Bay as a fishery to the ones that Frank left behind all those years ago. Frank retired from the big boat scene just before the now infamous recessions of the Thatcher years, which very quickly saw the charter industry there nosedive from a thriving attraction with around a dozen or so boats working out of the muddy tidal inlet at Jubilee Quay to virtually nothing. Then back to the present, with you operating as the only boat from what was the port's outer fish quay and is now a plush marina. Do you actually remember anything about the rise and fall of that chapter of Fleetwood's charter fishing story, or as a small boat angler, did that period in the town's history pretty much pass you by?
I actually started boat fishing on the old charter boats in Fleetwood, the Wire Angler and Princess Anne, operated by Birds. Predominantly, as I remember back, it was dabs and occasional place. Up in the bay, you did as well get an occasional reasonable codling in the spring showing. But we never seemed to sort of come round off Clevelis or Rossall to see any of the better codling. But that did set me off, so eventually, I think at the age of, I was approaching 16, to the horror of my parents, I bought this 12-foot mooring. Started sort of taking it down the beach at Norbreck, handballing it with a friend of mine down to the low water mark, and obviously, as being the partner going out, he got the opportunity to take my trailer back up to the wall again. And it was then really the adventure started of dinghy fishing. In those days, like I say, talking the late 70s into the early 80s, you started realising the potential and the opportunity of the fish available off the coast. In the spring we had the good runner place, again inside the low water mark. In the winter we had the opportunity of the cod and the jumbo cod that was showing at that time. So it was a natural progression from those early days from charter boat fishing in Fleetwood to buying my first dinghy and operating it and learning the seamanship the hard way, really, as it was, because there was no courses or anything available then. It was all learn as you go, and some experience obviously learnt the hard way.
I first got to know you when we were both launching our dinghies from the Fylde Boat Angling Club. I'm not sure exactly when that was, so being a bit younger than me, I'm also not sure how much of the legendary Fylde Coast jumbo cod era you actually saw. What are your recollections of the fishing back then?
The jumbo cod off the Fylde Coast was something to look forward to. Certainly at that time, like I say, moving on from 16 upwards, I'd changed boats from the moor end to a CJR at the time, 14-foot boat. The jumbo cod were probably a shorter period of time than what people would realise. I mean, realistically, I would start looking at the double figure fish, 20-pounders plus, round about Christmas week, and that would run on to round about the third week of February. It would be an occasion where you could come out one day and you'd bag up with cod. You'd come out the following day and you'd be lucky to have your bite. That's how critical the cod fishing was. Today, it's no different. If anything, it's just a slightly shorter period of time. But saying that, we are fortunate that we don't get a lull like we did in those days between the winter fish and spring fish. The spring fish do seem to be arriving early. The jumbo cod, though, it was an experience I would hope would return, and I think it probably will. Going out on a dinghy on my own, I remember many occasions where you'd have a bite on one rod and be fishing a couple of rods off the boat, and you'd hook the fish as your other rod was about to go over the side, so you found yourself putting your foot on the butt on one rod while striking and reeling in a fish on your other rod. By the time that one's in and on the boat, you're reeling in your other fish. And it was pretty persistent like that at times. It was a case of all or nothing. You'd come out and you'd have a really terrific day, or you'd come out and you might see an handful up to £15. But certainly in my experience, you know, we've had many a £20 to £30 fish through the 70s and the 80s. They did start to tail off and go down a bit in size through the 90s, and sad to say 2000 on, I think in the last sort of 7 years from 2010, the biggest fish aboard this boat has been 16.25 pound.
Obviously, it nosedived, and quite suddenly, into a period of average to poor cod fishing winters. Have you any thoughts on why those fish were there in the first place, and equally important, why they are not there today?
Looking back historically off the Fylde coast, if you look back to a book written by William Thornbacks, who was a historian of Blackpool, the 1800s, apparently the coast was awash with haddock. And in all the years fishing I've been out of Blackpool and Fleetwood, I can honestly say I've never seen an haddock caught.
It's funny you should mention haddock. I've never actually seen one off this coast myself, but I do know that several years ago, one of the members of the Blackpool Boat Angling Club down at South Shore brought two into the scales during a club match.
They say at that period of time that the haddock were that abundant that they were literally on the beach at Squires Gate on Arrowside, and just like the cod have done today, they disappeared overnight, never to be seen again. The cod, I think it's a slightly different prospect. Talking to one of the fisheries officers in Fleetwood, he says that the cod that we actually get off the Fylde coast are more nomadic. They're not actually a stock of cod that would annually come into the coast. It's more of a spur that breaks away from a main shoal of fish further afield that would winter here. Just as unexplainable as they break away and come off the coast, they can unfortunately leave the coast and rejoin the shoal. It is said though that this is something that does happen over a period of time, so who's to say that we won't get the jumbo cod again, because as at this time 2010 has been a better year for codling. Certainly, you know, for a good many years now we started catching them in July and they've been showing an increase in numbers. I'm happy to say we've come to November and there's many a day really that we're getting quite a few, up to sort of £3-4, so this could be it really.
When you say that you think these fish may come back at some stage, what are you basing this on?
History. Again, if you talk to people that were fishing off this coast during the war, the cod were prolific, the cod were large, and then it nosedived after the war. At the time, a lot of the old guys said it was the commercial fishing, because during the wartime there wasn't the commercial activity by trawling. Following the war there was a big commercial activity again, and it was the same excuse really as is used today, that the bigger fish was cleaned out by commercial overfishing. I don't think that is so actually. You know, it just seems historically a cycle that we're going through. I have heard on occasion that it's a cycle that may be over 20-30 years of from peak to trough. Again, time will tell.
Do you not think that commercial pressure will play some part in restricting Irish sea cod achieving those sorts of sizes ever again? I know there are less commercial boats about these days, but won't that just allow there to be more fish sharing the same food resource, with the effect that it will then be difficult for fish generally to really pile on the weight?
Talking to commercial fishermen and knowing the number of boats that did operate at Fleetwood once over, it could actually have a negative effect of size of fish without having the commercial side of it. That's based on that you could have a sea full of fish, but with only the same amount of food for them to feed on, smaller fish, which much as the same happened apparently in the Solent many years ago with the tope fishing, where there was a lot of tope killed expecting there to be an uptake of other fish in the area. But what actually happened is the size of fish went down because there was more fish but less food. So there's always going to be an argument about overfishing or underfishing. It's got to be a balance.
As you said earlier, you cut your angling teeth from small boats around the Fylde coast where you've enjoyed a great deal of success. But I know that you haven't only fished off the Lancashire coast, and that not all of your fishing was done purely for pleasure. There is, or at least there was, a competitive streak in you, and a very successful one at that.
Again, it's sort of a progression. At the time as well, I was heavily doing CIU League, which was Club and Institute, which generally over the year had a number of beach matches. So it sort of created a competition side to me. That continued with the boat fishing, which we started going afield. We had success over at Hartlepool with the top time competition. We won that one. Fishing the Stenner International off Wexford, I think 15 years that we'd fished that one. I'd won it 3 times, been runner-up a number of times, generally sort of in the top 6, which was obviously where we like to be. Yeah, so also Cardigan Bay, the Mid Wales Development Competition, runner-up twice there. Over the years as well, we'd fished Kinsale, Killybegs, obviously Daly Bay in Scotland for the place. So really, it was a natural progression as well. Instead of just being going for size and quality of fish, it was then becoming an obsession of to get as many different species of fish as you could. That's transferred over now to the chartering side, where many of the clubs today, instead of just fishing for a solitary big fish on the boat, between themselves try to fish for the number of species available. We've probably got to an average of close to 40 species in the year. The good old days of the 70s and the 80s of the jumbo cod, we'd have probably been lucky to have a dozen species in a year. So some things they say I like are better, but worse, but other things are certainly better.
Excellent credentials for becoming a successful charter boat skipper. But with such a heavy involvement with the small boat fishing scene, what was the final nudge that persuaded you to cross codes, so to speak?
That's a very good question. I did actually think probably the mid-1980s of going into chartering. I did actually do a local ticket to operate a boat, but when the time came, I ended up buying a bigger dinghy. So I guess what it was at that particular time I was happy doing the competition fishing. Work-wise as well, I was probably in a job I was too set in the sense of I'd been there from doing an apprenticeship. This was in the newspaper industry, and it's the same in many jobs. It was the only life I really knew, and it was a big step to leave that to actually go into what we're doing now. It actually came about very suddenly, really, leaving the newspapers, was that with the new technology and everything else, there was a thing over the years of people being made redundant, and the few people who were actually skilled in the job left, finding themselves inheriting other people's jobs to the degree where I was literally a nervous wreck. So it was a case of leave the newspaper industry for health reasons and go into a job where you don't even know what's happening tomorrow. Yeah, some might say psychotic.
Morecambe Bay as a fishery and Fleetwood as a base both have a lot going for them, particularly in terms of shelter from the prevailing southwesterly wind, which often keeps the Fylde Coast dinghies stuck on shore. But it also has its downside. Big spring tides, for example, are difficult to fish when you're confined inside the bay. So although you might have some degree of shelter, you can't always usefully use it. What then are the plus and minus points of being Fleetwood based?
I think the plus points is definitely that we have a continual conveyor belt of fish over the year. It's not somewhere where you would come out fishing for a type of fish all year round. It's constantly on the change. You can be coming out in the winter, as we said, with the codling, the whiting, the dabs, etc. In the spring you've got the early run of the Thornbacks, the plaice, followed by tope, smooth hound, bullus. The list is really endless now, the opportunities available to us out of Fleetwood. As you say about large tides, the spring tides and the neap tides, I would say that the neap tides, yes, do give you more opportunity about where you can go and fish. but really it's only the west-southwest, west to west-northwest that are critical, where anything really above a force 4, you've no shelter, so unfortunately you're cancelled. On a southerly wind, the fishing available in Morecambe Bay, particularly in the spring and summer with the place, you're sheltered, so it can be blowing force 4 or 5 and rough off Rossall, and you become quite comfortably fishing in 6 or 8 foot of water for place into the bay and catching them. But the biggest factor in the bay, and the biggest mistake that people can make, is going too deep a water. The majority of fish in the bay, plaice, bass, etc., do come from the shallow water.
What's it like also being based in a marina, which, while it's safe and secure, also has its downside? This morning, for example, we picked up at 7 AM after what was officially the coldest November night on record. I presume that you'll have been here in the middle of the night to get the boat out due to the restrictions placed on you by the lock gates. I know you didn't actually sleep on the mooring last night, but you have done before today. A side of charter skippering potential future charter boat operators wearing rose-tinted glasses don't ever consider, as indeed won't most anglers. On top of this, you've got decisions to make over the weather forecast, and from time to time, as with all vehicles, have mechanical problems to deal with. To what extent then does being based inside Fleetwood Marina control what you do?
You've certainly got to be dedicated. Fleetwood Marina is a very, like say, secure place to be. It's very useful and comfortable in the pontoons that you have there. As far as the fishing base though, it's very unfortunate with the lock-in times that we only, on a good tide, have an hour and a half each side of high water, which doesn't really fit in with most people's lives of fishing. So generally on the charters we try and keep the pick-up times between 6 AM in the morning and 12 lunchtime. Some might be a little bit before 6, but generally 6 to 12 pick-up times are the time we go for. The unfortunate side for me is to get out of the marina for a 6 AM pick-up usually entails leaving the dock anything sort of around about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, going back home for another 4 hours sleep before having to get the boat out of the dock channel before that dries for the 6 o'clock pick-up. So people sort of sometimes moan about getting up early for a 6 o'clock, but my day usually starts around about midnight on those. Likewise on the late pickups, it might mean coming back and taking the boat back into the marina at 11, half past 11, even midnight. It does involve as well once a fortnight dropping a tide between the lates and starting back on the early again. But generally, you know, with the weather patterns, you do obviously get your time off as well. So, you know, a fine day is definitely a bonus.
I'd like you then to take us through a typical day in your life in terms of preparation, because a lot of sea anglers see charter skippering as the ultimate job. I often get asked myself why I don't make the move across, out at sea every day pursuing your hobby and getting paid for it. But I know it isn't like that at all, and a lot of people simply don't realise what sort of a life charter skippering actually is. To my mind, it takes a very special kind of person. It's not just about the fish, particularly as you rarely ever get to catch them yourself anyway. You need the right temperament, good man management skills, and a very understanding bank manager too for those long periods lost due to the weather.
But, well, like we've just said there, the day doesn't start when people get on the boat. The day starts a good many hours before. You always have your preliminary checks like you would oil, water, even indeed filling the boat up with diesel. When you're running on a continual basis, you've got to make sure you've got that, the fuel. So this morning, for instance, just to keep me topped up, I did bring 50 litres of diesel down with me, which meant carrying 25 litres in one hand. That gets thrown into the tank just to maintain it, really. Otherwise, you find yourself sort of half a day sort of transporting diesel to the boat, which is a waste of a day. And in all this time as well, you've got to keep your wife happy in that the time that you're on the boat isn't time spent with her. So you get part of it as well where she's saying, like, you're not spending enough time on that boat. So you try to sort of compromise and do what you can in between. So really it's preliminary checks, make sure the boat's safe and secure for the day. Then annually you've got to take her out of the water. Coming up onto the beach has its drawbacks where you get the wear on the keel, which has to be constantly repaired on an annual basis. The painting as well, the general upkeep. As part of being a licensed boat to 60 miles, life jackets have to have lights on, which all have an expiry date, which have to be renewed. The life buoy on the side of the boat have the lights on, they have to be renewed. The life raft has to be renewed annually. It's just generally sort of not just the fishing side of it, it's the red tape that you have to make sure is correct. But at the end of the day, this red tape was brought in for the safety of the anglers, to make sure that charter boat skippers were doing their job, and it's not just a case of anglers coming out, you taking the money off them, and thanks very much. They have to have a safe environment.
And let's not forget mechanical wear and tear, plus costly breakdowns, which also need to be factored into the equation.
There is indeed. 2009 was a particularly bad year for me. We did have a bit of a leak between the heat exchanger, where the metal had gone porous at the end, so we were getting a transfer of seawater into the coolant, which caused the timing cover to corrode. And to cut a long story short, we ended up with a sump full of water, which ended up with the head off. A full sort of engine breakdown, really, which waited for parts or one thing or another. Was out the water for about 3 weeks. These are unforeseen. There's nothing you could really do about it. You wouldn't know that a metal had gone porous inside. Just an unfortunate event, really.
So it's a double whammy in that it costs you money to put the problem right, while at the same time the wages needed to pay for it dry up until you get the job done.
That's quite correct. It's certainly a job where you never know what tomorrow's going to bring. You have to sort of keep on, and as the old saying is, make hay while the sun shines.
These days, from a chartering perspective, you've pretty much got Fleetwood and Morecambe Bay all to yourself. Previously, there had been a dozen or so boats operating, but now it's all down to you. Are you still able to find good numbers of everything, including passengers, that the area was once famous for, or had things changed, or maybe even worse still, gone into decline?
The number of charter boats out of Fleetwood, it would, I mean, up to sort of 2-3 years back, there was 3 charter boats operating out of Fleetwood. I wouldn't really say that passenger number wise there's really any difference. We can serve, people sort of through the week, Monday to Friday, as well as the weekends, and people take advantage of that. It's a tricky question. But people, if they want to go fishing, they've only got to pick up the phone. They sometimes might have to wait a week or two, but I'm sure that we can fit them in. It does show nationally, though, what a wonderful job it is, though, by the number of people that are not doing it. So it's not all a good thing, although it's, if you've been a seasoned angler, it's the ultimate job to have. It isn't always the fantastic job that people think it is, because you do have bad days as well as good. You have days when weather isn't quite as good as others. It isn't always sunny and flat, calm seas.
What about species mix? Has the balance there changed in any way? Are there species available now that were not present before, putting a changing emphasis on how you plan your trips?
The codling now are on a shorter season to what they used to be. I mean, generally we could expect the cod to sort of mid-February, 3rd week of February. Now I would say they're all but finished by the end of January. That said, in the last number of years we have started picking place up mid-February. In the past, I think you would have found that there had been a lull between the cod leaving the middle of February to the place arriving in April. So over the year it is more consistent. There are more fish to be had. Indeed, the thornback rays do show there as well if the weather's quite mild. If it's not, then they'll show up at usual times around about April, inshore now rather than in the bay.
I was intending to ask you about the thornback situation. Nationally, ray numbers now appear to be historically low, yet the River Mersey just down the way is currently full of the things. Has there been any sort of revival out in the bay over the old marks such as the cricket pitch that could in the past always be relied upon to produce the goods? Or do you perhaps no longer visit these marks, preferring to keep pace with changing circumstances?
Well, it's to a degree there, yes, we could go and fish Morecambe Bay, but the thornbacks seem to have relocated rather than declined. In the summer now you can fish within half a mile of the low water mark of Cleveless and pick quite a number up. Further offshore, if you start going a mile and a half out, you start seeing fish of 15-18 pounds. So I don't think it's so much that there's been a decline of the rays, it's more of a relocation, which as an old man once said, they've got fins, they can go where they want.
The last time I was out with you, the plan had been to motor over to Walney Island to try for a mix of species out over the rough ground, but the sheer numbers of tope in the area that day put paid to that idea. Is that still the case? Tell us a little bit about the local tope fishing scene.
Tremendous, as it is on this side of the bay. I mean, tope, fortunately, is a fish that if we get a party specifically want to fish for, it isn't a problem. Generally, the tope are showing from mid-May onwards, peaking on size round about June, July, but it's certainly not a fish either side of the bay that you're going to struggle to catch. The problem sometimes is actual bait to catch the tope. If the water's a bit mucky, then we're not going to get the tope. We have to buy the fish. I did actually go up on the bow this summer with a scratching mackerel rig, 2 little tiny bits of mackerel on, hooked into a tope on the bottom, around about, I would estimate about 10 to 15 pound, and just as my top hook's coming clear of the water, I had another tope around about 35 pound take the top hook. So you can imagine you've got 5 feathers and 2 tope and about 15 pound main line. Needless to say, I had a set of feathers with only 3 hooks on rather than the 5.
You've mentioned smooth hounds. Although this is now a well-established species along the Fylde coast, it hasn't always been that way, and to get the best out of them does require some measure of specialisation, particularly with regard to bait choice, the best of which is crab. What advice then would you give to prospective clients wanting to take advantage of this very exciting potential?
Well, the smooth hound, again, they arrive usually around about the same time as the first peel of crab, which is around about middle of May, early May to mid-May. The number one bait definitely for catching smooth hound is crab. It doesn't necessarily have to be peeler, which a lot of people believe. They will readily take hardback crabs, which falls in line really if you've been doing a bit of shallow water fishing and unfortunately caught a crab or two. It's not that unfortunate because you can put them in the bucket and use them for the smooth hound. I think followed by crab, probably a worm or squid cocktail. Not too far out, again you tend to sort of be within a mile of the coast. Cleveland's area is probably one of the most prolific for smooth hound, and expect anything from a few pounds up to anything up to £20 I would say these days. And who's to say, like I said, we have seen one bigger than that, so you know one day the record for smooth hound could be broken off the Fylde coast if things continue.
When I first started fishing along the Fylde, we never saw smooth hounds, or perhaps we did but simply didn't recognise them, possibly labelling them a small tope. Now the things seem to be everywhere and becoming more prolific year on year. What are your thoughts on suggestions that these, plus a few other new species, are here as a result of climatic change, particularly as smooth hounds suddenly seem to burst onto the scene a couple of seasons back to the north of us along Scotland's Solway coast?
A difficult question, because as well as the smooth hound becoming prolific off the coast, I would say the gurnards have as well. Now, in the past, I think historically, if you wanted a big gurnard, then you'd have gone to North Wales. We are now seeing, like I said, gurnard up to £8, and we have had them at 6 and 7s, and quite a regular thing now is 3s and £4 gurnards. Good eating fish, but never really noted as getting off the Fylde coast as we do today. The smooth hound has sort of followed the same sort of line. I remember getting one probably the late 70s. I had to go and look it up, what it was, this strange looking fish with silver speckles down its back. Since that day, I think on a year on year, they have indeed, like you correctly say, increased in numbers. Whether it's a slightly warming of coastal waters due to the number of nuclear power stations around the coast now, I don't know, because the other fish that we do prolifically get up here is the bass. Something else that if you caught one, it was something to be proud of. Now if you catch one, it's just another fish.
Do you find that the bass fishing now is as good as it was several years ago, when the Shell Wharf and Heysham area was alive with the things, which, as you might expect, then took a bit of a hammering?
The biggest hammering they've probably had is from anglers themselves. The problem anglers tend to be is very critical about commercial people. It might be a little bit political what I'm saying, but they call the commercial men the trawlermen, but they're quite happy if the bass are available to catch as many as they can to sell them on the black market or indeed, you know, some of them, if they're that confident, they will licence the boats to do it legally. But if the bass weren't there, I think they'd be the first people to moan and start pointing the finger at other areas. But anglers can sometimes be their own worst enemies.
And is the species now going into decline compared to what was available even a couple of years ago?
I wouldn't say so, no. I would say at the moment it's a fish that's definitely on the increase, both in numbers and size. For years we're led to believe there's a very slow growing fish, but Morecambe Bay particularly has had for a number of years now get an increased number and size of sort of 6, 8 and 10 pound fish that once over you'd have only dreamt about.
Now, you mentioned on the way out another species which interests me, but one which I don't have a lot of experience with locally, that being the pollock. Maybe I just don't go to the right places, though to be honest, it isn't something we've ever specifically tried for either. Yet you offer this as something of a speciality option.
Yeah, the pollock, I think they came about more of an accident. It was one autumn, we was fishing off Rossall, and particularly one area we kept on sort of picking up odd pollock around about £3-4 pound, and it became sort of quite consistent with one particular area. So I did spend quite a bit of time moving a degree or two here or there, and eventually I did find the remains of what appears to be a small wreck off Rossall. Not the Galilean which sank in the sort of last 20 years, it is indeed another one. Not a lot of it left, obviously. There must be a few timbers sticking up, seems to be lying on the side, but it does seem to consistently hold pollock from round about late August through to November. If you get a clear day in the water, you know, nice clear water, put a jelly worm on, do a slow retrieve along the bottom, you can usually bag a few up to sort of £6, which once over was unheard of off Rossall.
You've actually just triggered something else in my mind with the mention of the pollock. Back in the 1980s, when we fished over the winter months for the big cod, maybe once or twice a season, we'd also pick up a good coalfish or two on the bottom baits. The best of these was probably into loadable figures, but I've never seen nor heard of one for years. Have you had any experiences with coalfish?
No. The only experience of coalfish really has been if we venture over to Barrow in the summer months. You do tend to pick up a few coalfish up over that side, although the size does tend to be small. But I've never had one, certainly in the last sort of 7 or 8 years off Rossall.
How do you see the future of Fleetwood for you as a charter skipper, and as importantly, as a major player on the North West Sea angling scene for the future?
I would say probably that charter boat fishing is probably going to go full circle as dinghy fishing is, as from my perspective, looks like it's doing now. In the 1970s, if you had a 12-foot boat, then that was the norm. If you had a CGR, then you were some sort of pop star. Nowadays, boats have got bigger, where 17-foot, 18-foot seems to be norm for launching off the beach. On the downside, you've got a hell of a lot of cost to be sat in a driveway doing nothing for what could be weeks on end. And indeed, with the way the world is today, the price of fuel is not a cheap commodity that it once was. Summer's gone by, you would think nothing of steaming across Barrow on a regular basis. Nowadays, I hardly see any dinghies going to Barrow. Weekends, 20-30 years ago, you'd have seen in excess of 100 dinghies fishing off the coast, whereas today, if you see sort of 20 or 30, then it's exceptional. Most days it seems to be an handful. Charter boat fishing, on the other hand, it is something that's accessible to anybody, novice or experienced anglers. We welcome all. We can only offer the fishing available to the time of the year and on the day. But I think charter boating certainly got a future, because it would probably be more cost effective to the man on the street than laying out the £15,000 or so on a boat, plus his insurance and fuel, and then you need to be in a club to launch it. So really, I think there is a big future for charter boating out of Fleetwood and indeed around the UK.
And do you feel that perhaps because of its strategic geographical positioning, allied to the fact that it does enjoy some shelter, it will remain a major player?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we do get a lot of customers coming up from the Manchester, Liverpool area, right round the Pennines, Blackburn, Burnley, Oldham, going up to Morecambe and the South Lakes. So definitely we are increasingly as well getting people coming from further afield. For example, the East Coast, which is quite strange for the cod fishing they have on the East Coast. We are getting a number of people now coming over here specifically to fish for the tope during the summer.
Finally, are there any regrets at making the move from dinghy angler to charter skipper? Would you still recommend it to those people out there who also see it as the ideal job, or maybe even a glamorous way of making a living?
It's certainly not a glamorous way of making a living. It's like we said earlier, you never know what tomorrow's going to bring. If you get a run of deep depressions, strong westerly winds, then it's not like your job, you know, where you're consistently going to get paid every Thursday or Friday or every month. You know, you can actually go a week or two without any money coming in at all, so you do have to be quite prudent with your money. Dinghy fishing, like I say, I think to some degrees I do miss the opportunity of being able to have a boat on a trailer and take around different parts of the UK and indeed Ireland. With a charter boat you are very much one port based, unless you completely up sticks and move to another part of the country. So yeah, you've got to know what you're getting into and take all aspects of it before you actually do it.
One aspect that a lot of prospective charter skippers need to take on board is that although you do spend a lot of time out at sea, little, if any, of that time is actually spent by you fishing.
No, it's very true that. Like I say, I've spent my years of competition fishing. No doubt I've had good years. Nowadays it's taking that experience and giving it to everybody else really that wants it. If you get a party of novice anglers on and they get off and they've all caught fish, they remember that day and they're back again. And you know, in months or years to come, you eventually see them coming with their own rod and reel, and you know, they're happy to do that. So no, it's not the job to go into thinking that you're going to sit outside the boat and fish all day, because at the end of the day you're offering the service to people who are paying you to catch fish. They're not coming on board the boat for you to catch the fish for them. So you know, you've got to make sure that the guys are catching the fish and they're happy doing that. If they're happy, I'm happy.
So all things considered, no regrets?
No, not at all. It's just been a natural progression really over a period of time. Started in the dinghies and eventually sort of ended up in a bigger boat. If I want to put a rod out and I've got a slack party on, I do now and again. It's not a job where you're not totally fishing forever. It's just you do it when the opportunity arises, but not at the expense of the party that you have paying.
And that's probably a very good point to end on. So thanks for that, Andy. At least by being here just to do the interview recording, I was able to hide in the cabin from the bitter cutting northeasterly wind, which is more than you were able to do, having to go out there and work with your anglers on the deck.